It was a record-breaking career from a time when Welsh politicians were also big on the British stage. James Callaghan is the only British politician to make it to number 10, having first held all 3 top cabinet jobs. But if he was so good at running his own career, why did it all go so badly wrong for the party he led? For Labour loyalists, he was Lucky Jim, a shrewd party boss and skilled maker of deals. But 18 Labour wilderness years followed. So was Lucky Jim also a stroke of luck for the Tories?
On the face of it, Jim Callaghan has this terrific CV, and yet the 3 departmental offices before he became Prime Minister were marked by more failure than success, if one's candid.
I think you either need some reformist zeal, some crusading ideas, or some socialist conviction, really. And Jim never pretended to have any of those things.
He was responsible for the demoralisation of significant sections of Labour voters in British society, with the result that Thatcher, in May 1979, was allowed to creep into power.
I'm a lucky man with fire in my hand.
It was a tough start for Leonard James Callaghan, born in 1912 in Portsmouth and growing up in genteel poverty. His father, a naval officer of Irish descent, died when the boy was just 9. In the depressed 30s, the young Callaghan found the security he needed by joining the Inland Revenue. But he also found another safe berth by joining the Labour Party and rising from the bottom up.
Jim Callaghan was maybe the last Labour leader that will come right through the ranks without the benefit of university education, because they'd experienced the 30s and then fought a war, came back with the determination never again. And that was his real, I think, original motivating force in going into Parliament.
Eloquent, smooth and very determined, the wartime naval officer was adopted by the Cardiff South Labour Party as its parliamentary candidate. The inner city constituency, dominated by the docks, would be a seat for life.
We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when.
1945 was springtime for Labour and for Callaghan. The landslide was the start of his Westminster career. His new Cardiff constituents loved him.
Everybody loved Callaghan. He was a brilliant fellow. My dad and Jim Callaghan were very, very great friends when they lived on the bay. I don't know if Jim will remember it now. We're going back a long time, Jim.
Drive the dark clouds far away.
The political career rise was pretty vertical, with Callaghan getting a ministerial job in 1947. But it was during Labour's opposition years in the 50s and early 60s that he built up his own power base within the party.
Callaghan had a pretty extraordinary record, both at gaining the support of his fellow MPs in shadow cabinet elections and at the same time winning the support of party activists in the elections to the Labour's national executive.
He knew how the Labour Party worked. He had an instinctive feel for it, and he was both able and willing to make the compromises that you have to do to run a political party.
The great fixer soon found that he himself needed a fixer. Affairs of state might preoccupy him more and more, but Callaghan needed someone on the ground in Cardiff, someone he could trust. And in 1966 he found him in Jack Brooks, a former semi-professional boxer and part-time decorator who became Callaghan's agent. Brooks would be Callaghan's second pair of eyes and ears, informing him on local developments, arranging meetings with his constituents, keeping the great man accessible. But money would complicate that constituency reputation. Callaghan was in charge of raising money for the party's national campaigns, and in Julian Hodge he found a local pal for both purposes. It was hard labour, for the party's finances were always pretty rocky. But at least Callaghan thought he'd found a reliable resource, right there, in his own backyard. Julian Hodge was a leading financier who had given donations to Callaghan's political campaigns in the 1960s. But he was controversial. And to private eye, he was a juicy subject for investigation, since many of his businesses were based on remortgaging and hire purchase.
One of the problems that politicians face, or men of power face, is that successful businessmen like to be associated with them.
Sir Julian, knighted in 1970, had a big idea with a grand name, the Bank of Wales.
Money, 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 must be funny in the rich man.
Labour were out of power in the early 1970s, and so Sir Julian was able to put two Cardiff MPs he had long supported on the board of the new bank. James Callaghan and George Thomas's cordial moments were rare, but Hodge patronage could bring them together.
40 years ago, we had 500 collieries in South Wales. Today, we have less than 50. The Bank of Wales, by providing capital for the development of indigenous Welsh industry, will, in my opinion, go a very long way to help solve this question of the depopulation of the valleys.
My impression was it was sold as the Bank of Wales. It was given this prestige title when in fact it was no more than a secondary bank, really. It was another money-lending institution, essentially.
Labour's Welsh supporters were uneasy. Why should Callaghan risk his reputation by associating himself with Cardiff's credit king?
It was the millionaire and the top politician on the one hand, a very close relationship, and it was the housing conditions for which Jim was the representative. And that sort of glaring inequality seemed to deserve some sort of comment.
Dumbleton soon became a writer on Rebecca, a magazine which started in the early 70s and which, like Private Eye, specialised in satirical and investigative journalism, but for a Welsh audience.
Rebecca was a rather startling magazine that began to ask questions that had never really been asked in South Wales before about connections between business and government.
We don't get fooled again. Don't get fooled again.
We wrote on a wall a slogan that got taken up by the press, you know. Our insulting slogan was, I think, Jim loves Julian more than Splot. And we wrote it in big letters in Splot, where we thought, A, it was the truth, and B, it was a justified insult.
Some local activists feared that Callaghan, the cosy boss, was taking their party to the right.
There was a determination to rid the Labour Party of socialists, to destroy Marxists who were in the Labour Party, and Marxism is one of the historical traditions of the Labour Party. He helped to destroy that, and in helping to destroy that, he paved the way for new Labour.
And all the time, through thick and thin, there was loyal Jack Brooks, holding the fort.
One of the tragedies of Jim Callaghan is really the people like Jack, like others, who worked for him, spent large amounts of their life's blood promoting his political career, when I think they could have had independent and strong and useful radical political careers of their own.
And Brooks's workload would be even greater after Harold Wilson's sudden resignation in 1976. Jim and Audrey had finally made it to number 10. It was Callaghan's biggest and luckiest break. But the economic policy of the new Premier, called monetarism, hit Cardiff right where it hurt.
Monetarism was the fashion in those days. Apparently you were able to bring inflation down and control inflation by cutting off the money. Just cut off the money and down comes inflation.
Following hard on the heels of the high-spending governments of the 1960s, the Semptive squeeze led to the closure of British Steel's East Moors plant. 4,000 lost their jobs. Having arrived at the top, Callaghan in government was closing down manufacturing in his own constituency.